Welcome all. We're all happy to be here together again. And we're delighted and thank the IMF for providing us as host, particularly in this very busy time of the interim committee meetings. They've been, and the staff, as always, of the IMF has done a great job in helping the Bretton Woods Committee pursue its duties. I also want to thank very much the sponsors of this meeting, which are UBS, and of course the chairman of UBS, Axel Weber, will be on the agenda later in the day. Very happy to have them, and thanks to him and his bank, and SICBA, who are long-standing supporters of the Bretton Woods Committee. We're very grateful for their help. Today, well, actually, I'm supposed to tell you about your cell phones and so forth. I want you to know that this year I turned mine off. If you do the same, we'd all be happy. And also to say we're going right through, no break, no coffee break or anything, ending up with a reception at about 5:30. Today we're here to discuss economic, political, technical shifts that are disrupting major sectors of the world, actually, and challenging everybody to see how we can deal with things differently for the future. We have a very distinguished group here, and we're ready to start, I believe. My one great regret is that Jim Wolfenson, who was scheduled to be here at the last minute, couldn't quite make it, and but he sent his greatest, warmest wishes, and we'll be in touch with him again. Now, our co-chair, Jim Kolbe, who's here. Jim, as you well know, has served for 22 years as a congressman from Arizona. 22 years, young fella still. He's stepping in for Jim for the first session of our agenda today. And our leading guest will be the president of the World Bank, Mr. Yong Kim, who I believe is very close to being. He's here. Good. We're delighted. In that case, Jim, would you come up and introduce our leading speaker?
Thank you. Dr. Kim, how are you? Great. So good to see you again. Thank you. We come from opposite sides of the stage here to say hello to each other here, but Dr. Kim, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Congressman
once
Kolbe.
again,
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you here. I think everybody, we really don't need a lot of introduction for Dr. Kim. He's been with us before, and I think everybody knows his distinguished background, but I thought it was interesting to note that since we're approaching the 75th anniversary, that you are the 12th president of the World Bank, and we appreciate your making time in your schedule to be with us here today. You're finishing up almost 6 years now as president of the bank, and with a very distinguished career in education as president of Dartmouth College and in medicine at Harvard University, and a variety of other places that he's worked in public service. But certainly now he's in a role which is one of great importance. And Dr. Kim, I'd like to really just start off by saying, you know, in the 6 years that you've been president, we've seen a lot of changes that have taken place in the world, in the economies of the world today. And I'm just wondering if you might, as a broad question to get us started here, just tell us what your vision, if you were to imagine, look into the crystal ball and think about what the economy is going to look like 1 year, 5 years from now, what do you think it's going to be, and how does the World Bank fit into that? How is it going to have to adapt in order to adjust to the changes that are taking place in the world economy today that we're seeing?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to thank members of the Bretton Woods Committee, because so many of you have helped us on IDA, before IDA 18, and also with the discussions that we're continuing to have on the capital increase. And so the Bretton Woods Committee members have been just a really great ally in this battle. And I also wanted to thank you, Congressman Kolbe. You may not remember, but when I was a young whippersnapper, I came to talk to you about AIDS funding, if you remember.
I do remember that.
So at a time when there was great danger of the world turning their backs on the 20+ million people living with HIV when there was treatment available, President Bush, of course, was a great hero, and Africans still remember him as being this incredibly visionary leader who was in favor of HIV treatment. But before that happened, you were extremely supportive of us and saved many, many millions of lives. So thank you for that.
Well,
right?
thank you. Thank you.
But in terms of, there's been so much happening. Let me just, look, I don't know exactly what the world of work or what the economy is going to look like in 5 or 10 years. But there are people who are putting out very specific visions of what it's going to look like. And let me just give you one of them. Jack Ma, who's the CEO of Alibaba, says, and he's been saying this publicly, he said to me, he said, every single muscle-powered job will be replaced by machines. And the other thing he says, which is really even more challenging, is that every single knowledge-based job will also be replaced by machines through artificial intelligence. And he says, my grandfather worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and he felt very busy. I work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and I feel very busy. My children will work 3 hours a day, 3 days a week, and they'll feel very busy, right? So I don't know if that's true, but then we have to step back and say, so if at least part of that is true, what does it mean? It means that everyone will have access to broadband internet very soon. Many people say by 2025, and everywhere I go in the world, I see this happening, that once they get access to broadband, even if they don't own a smartphone, they have access to one. They can look at one. And so everyone will know how everyone else lives. That's going to happen very, very soon. And then, you can, listening to different pundits about what's going to happen to jobs, probably the one thing everyone agrees on is that a lot of the low-skilled tasks will be taken over by machines. An example of that in Bangladesh, one of the assumptions that many development economists made was that, well, technology may take over, but you'll always need human hands for making garments or making shoes. Bangladesh is the most efficient and probably one of the largest garment industries in the world. And from 2003 to 2010, they created 300,000 jobs a year in the garment industry. Last year was 60,000, and it's going down because even in Bangladesh, they're buying robots, German robots, who now make the garments. They're called sew bots, S-E-W bots. And so if we see that happening, the question we have to ask is then if the traditional path of agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy industry is not going to be a path that many poor countries can go down, what are people going to do? And especially people with higher aspirations, the more they see the internet, the more they see how everyone else lives, their aspirations go up. And so we found ourselves having to innovate in just about every area. So 2 goals, end poverty, boost shared prosperity. And the way to get there is economic growth, but in this case, inclusive, sustainable economic growth. The second area is to build resilience. We need to help countries all over the world adapt to things like climate change and refugees and pandemics and so many other overlapping crises that we're living through right now. And then finally, the third, the one that we're really focusing on, especially during this meeting and the annual meeting coming in October, is human capital. What we're finding is that many, many, many countries are not prepared to compete in what will surely be a more digitally demanding economy in the future. And in order to get to each of those, growth and resilience and human capital, we've had to innovate. We've had to think of all new ways of raising the kind of capital that we needed. In 1960, 70% of all of financial flows to developing countries was in the form of official development assistance. Last year, it was about 8%. So official development assistance now is tiny compared to the overall capital flows. And so in order for us to be effective and in order for us to be relevant, we've had to think of many, many different ways. Just yesterday, we for the first time took IDA, our fund, the capital that sits in IDA, and we went to the capital markets. And we were very happy to find that the capital markets were extremely interested in purchasing our bonds, and so the price was actually very, very low. The bond spreads were very low. And we also know that we have to work to crowd in private capital. There's still $8 trillion in the world sitting in negative interest rate bonds. And so if we could mobilize some of that capital and use that to invest in, say, infrastructure in developing countries, we'll get so much more bang for the official development assistance bucks that exist. You know, for protecting the world from pandemics and from you know, problems like refugees, we've had to also be innovative. So we finally, for the first time, and you're because of your interest, you'll like this, we asked the question, so why is it that whenever a pandemic starts, we have to wait until some country decides to be generous and finance it? Why couldn't we insure the world against pandemics? And it had never been done before, but as of last year, I actually did the bond pricing call for our first ever in the world pandemic insurance bond. And we now have insured the 75 poorest countries against epidemics. So the Ebola crisis would not happen today because the money would be released much, much earlier to fight it. And it's a very straightforward 3-year capital at risk bond. And again, we weren't sure that the markets would be interested in it, but that too was twice oversubscribed because we paid 8.7% on average over a 3-year period, and people were so desperate for return that they were willing to risk losing all the capital because it is capital at risk. So we continue to do that. The next thing we're working on now is famine insurance. We asked the same question: why is it that we always wait till it's so late in a famine? Because usually famines aren't declared by the UN until it gets to stage 5, which is the worst stage. And what we know is that if we intervened at stage 3, we would prevent a lot of the terrible outcomes, and we would actually turn famines around early on. And so we're now once again talking with Swiss Re and Munich Re, who didn't believe we could do pandemic insurance, but when we did it, they got really excited about it. And so now we're talking with them, and I think we're going to be able to insure the poorest countries against famines in the not too distant future. So, you know, the disrupted world, it means that we too have to be as innovative as possible and bring our own disruptions to the table.
You've said so much here, there's so many questions that I think we all have here, and I want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions, but just a very specific one. On this last point, who triggers the announcement of a famine, or is that the World Food Organization? And by the way, would it include famines that result from political disruptions, such as Yemen? So
most of the famines in the last 20 years have been the result of some kind of conflict, right? But what we found is that it's still possible to intervene early. We could have intervened, if we had intervened earlier in Yemen, we would have been much, much better off. Again, we intervened too late. And what happens is that it's the UN that declares the different stages of famine. For pandemics, what we had to do is to bring disease modelers, infectious disease doctors, and the insurance companies together in one room. And they hardly ever sit in one room together. So when we did that, they came up with the annual incidence, the annual potential of an epidemic or a pandemic in any given year, plus they came up with the triggers that would get the money released. And it was a difficult negotiation, but now that we have it, we've got it. And so for 8.7% of the overall pot of money, which is about $450 million, instead of waiting and not knowing what's going to happen and then end up spending many billions of dollars as we do with Ebola, for 8.7% of the 450 million, every year we're insured, especially in the poorest countries, against that problem. And so the same thing with famine. We'll have to get a bunch of people in a room together and decide, so when would it trigger, and how would it be utilized, who would receive it? And we didn't, before the pandemic, we didn't know if the world could come up with something like that. But now that we do, we're going to move forward.
Going back to, you earlier mentioned about the World Bank and its need to, that the capitalization for assistance in the world is coming not so much from the international organizations as much as it comes from the private sector today. But you've recently launched a program called Maximizing Finance for Development. And it's an initiative, and you call it billions to trillions.
Right.
Tell us how you expect that to happen and how much of that is going to be done through the capital that comes from governments versus the private sector.
Yeah. So, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals were incredibly ambitious. But what we're now seeing is that because everyone knows how everyone else lives, the Sustainable Development Goals are actually reflecting what people are going to want. They're going to want, you know, all of these things at the same time. And so if you look at the price tag, if you were to achieve all the Sustainable Development Goals over the next, you know, up until 2030, the annual price tag is $4 trillion a year. And all of official development assistance is about $140 billion. So if you rely on ODA is extremely important. The generosity of donors is extremely important. But if you rely on that, we will never get even close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals at $4 trillion a year. And so what we're saying is, are there examples where projects are commercially viable, and instead of providing governments with a loan for which they have to provide a sovereign guarantee and then pay back, is it possible to get the private sector to go in and actually do it? And so we have there's great examples. So the Queen Ali International Airport in Jordan, and any of you who've been to Amman know that that's a great airport. Originally, they came and they said, you know, the government said, we'd like to take a loan and we will run the airport. And working against his own incentives, which is to give that loan, one of our employees said, you know, actually, this is commercially viable. We should do this through the private sector. So instead of giving the government a loan, IFC, our private sector group, came in and made the first $250 million investment. At the end of the day, it was $1 billion airport, but financed purely on commercial terms. And then the vendor, the group that ran it, there were a bunch of groups that wanted to run the airport, but a French group won the bidding. And so over the last 9 years, without paying a single penny of debt repayment, without putting a single penny into the airport, they were going to pay for about half of it. Without putting a single penny into the airport, they've received over $1 billion because they own 54% of the airport and therefore get 54% of the proceeds. So instead of putting money in, they've been getting money out without having to put money in. So that's our best example. There are a bunch of examples like that. And the problem with the multilateral development bank system is that because that project was so was commercially viable, it meant that it was easy to prepare. And normally what we would do is all compete to try to give a sovereign guaranteed loan for that, because that's how the incentives are aligned. That, you know, if you get your loan out the door for that project and don't pay attention to whether it was commercially viable, then you know, we are arguing that we would be shortchanging that country. Right? So we're now working on the basis of what we call a cascade. The first question we ask is this project commercially viable? Because what we hear from private sector representatives all the time is, you know, that was commercially viable, but you basically crowded us out. Because of course it's easier for them to take a loan. It's easier for them to take a loan. It doesn't mean it's going to be run better. It doesn't mean it's going to be more efficient, but it's easier for them just to take the loan than, for example, to make the policy changes to make it possible for the private sector to invest. So first question is it commercially viable? If it is, we have to agree on almost ethical terms that none of us will come in and provide a sovereign guaranteed loan. And then the next question is, well, if it's not immediately commercially viable, are there things we can do? For example, can the World Bank, the public sector part, work with the government to make the kind of policy changes to make it commercially viable? Or do we need guarantees, political risk insurance, credit enhancement, all the tools that we have? If we put those on the table, then will it become commercially viable? And then if it's not, then of course we'll look at, you know, loans or grants. But we're committed to doing that in every country in the world. And so we feel that the only chance we have to reach the Sustainable Development Goals is to bring in that money and to get people to feel more comfortable investing in the developing world. Because right now, I talk to the leaders of the great private equity firms, the great investment houses, and they think about Africa as just risk. It's all risk, right? As opposed to saying, well, Africa is very different from place to place, and even within specific countries. In order for us to be able to get, say, the asset allocators, people who run sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, in order to get them to feel more comfortable, we have to take this approach where we get them to think about risk reward in a very different way. There's this whole world now that's talking about impact investing. And frankly, unfortunately, it's mostly talk. It's mostly talk because not much of it actually gets done. But if indeed we're moving in a direction where people are not just saying, risk-adjusted reward or risk-adjusted returns, and they're saying we're going to look at risk, reward, and impact, well, we can help with that. And we think that that's one of our most important priorities.
Dr. Hibby, I think you've said so much here that stimulates a lot of thinking here. If you're agreeable, we'll take in the few remaining minutes. We'll take
Absolutely,
a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, and I see the first hand back here, please identify yourself and please ask a question and keep it as short as possible so we can get as many in, please.
Of course.
And back over here. Next.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. We've been hearing a lot of what you just spoke of, these new public-private partnerships. But as we look at a world 10 or 20 years from now, are we looking at a world where more public assets are sold and developed and end up in private hands?
Well, I think from our perspective, we're trying to remain as agnostic as we can be about ownership. So, for example, the Vietnamese government about, it's over 20 years ago now, they realized that they were just bleeding money into many of their state-owned enterprises. And so they came to us and asked, so what can we do differently? And we said, well, we don't want to give you ideology, but here's what you could do. You could sell a chunk of the state-owned enterprises to a private company. They'll bring their modern approaches to running a company like that. And you can decide how much of it you want to sell. You can always sell less than half of it if you want, but we think that'll help you. And it's even possible that instead of putting money into that company every year because they're losing, you might actually get not only taxes, but you might get some profit out of that company. And so that worked well enough early on that they did this with many of their companies, but they didn't want to call it privatization, so they called it equitization. Okay? And Australia has an interesting word for recycling of assets. There's lots of ways of talking about it. And for us, as a World Bank group, we're not doing this as advocates for any company or advocates for any private sector industry. We're doing it as advocates for poor people, for the people living in a particular country. And so we're trying to approach this from an evidence base. We're not ideologically calling for the private ownership of all assets. What we're calling for is how can you literally maximize finance for development in a way that will lead you to what our targets are, which is the end of extreme poverty and boosting the prosperity of the poorest 40%. What would it take to get us there? And so, just to give you an example, we knew that the energy system in Egypt would require private sector investment to get them to the level that they needed to get to. We couldn't do it with all public financing. And so we went in, and this was just a few years ago, and with the money that we provided to the government, they made a number of major changes in their policy structure, and the changes were important enough and significant enough that now an additional, I think the total amount is $3 or $4 billion, an additional $3 or $4 billion of private capital, and frankly, the private investors were not interested in going into Egypt in the energy sector before this, but we were able to make enough changes that now the private sector has invested, and it's meant greater access to energy and lower prices for the entire country. At the same time, they've gotten rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which we knew, especially in Egypt, were a huge part of their public expenditures, and regressive. In other words, they benefited the rich much more than they benefited the poor. So the idea is to make the policy changes necessary to bring in the private sector, but always with an eye on ensuring that everybody benefits. So that's how we approach it. That's how we approach it, and we are focused on being as evidence-based as possible. And it's not trying to move toward either more private or more public ownership. It's trying to create the most efficient system you can imagine, so that everybody has a job, or that everyone has access to education, everyone has access to energy. We're trying to be the neutral broker that sits in between the private and the public sector, but we're also the champion of the countries, but specifically the poor people of those countries. I think there's an important role for an organization like the World Bank that doesn't have a specific interest, but has to work between sectors to make a contribution.
And the next question was over here, then we'll take one from this side, and that'll probably be all we'll get. Have time for.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and thank you for hosting this. Looking at the nations themselves, Mr. President, how do you think that what 2 or 3 things should they think about as they're starting to approach the World Bank and other international bodies before they're even in the formal application process, so they're more streamlining towards what you think is really the pathway forward for these sovereign nations to really gain back much of their sovereignty and be able to realize the benefits that they're going to put their money into?
Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Thanks for the, we're at the World Bank Group now. We have a whole team of people who are now trying to understand better how, say, technology, artificial intelligence, how that's going to affect the economy of the future. And so one of the things that we're trying to think about is what are the investments that you could make that would be no regret? What are the things that you know if you invest in are going to be useful down the line? And the way I asked the question to my own team is, about 25, 30 years ago at the World Bank Group, we had a heated debate on whether we should invest in telephone poles in India. Okay? And luckily, it was close, but luckily we decided not to invest in telephone poles in India because we thought there may be a future for this thing called cellular phone service. Now, I keep asking my own teams, are we doing the equivalent of investing in telephone poles in India with our portfolio? Have we future-proofed our portfolio? And we have to think about that, but the countries have to think about it even more, right? So, there are large middle-income countries, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, that have childhood stunting rates. Indonesia 37%, India 38%, Pakistan 45%. And childhood stunting, we've now just done very recent research. And childhood stunting means that you're either through malnutrition or lack of stimulation or being in a toxic environment, you have literally fewer neuronal connections. So you're shorter, and the way we measure stunting is very simple. We just look for children who are 2 standard deviations below the normal height for age. And so if you're a stunted child, we have the data that you have a much more difficult time learning in school, and you have a much more difficult time earning when you finish school. And so when you're a middle-income country and you have close to 40% of your children who very well may be unable to compete in the digital economy of the future, you've got a problem. And so we think that investing in human beings is one of the clearest no-regret investments you can make. And so we're going to, in October, we're going to launch a human capital ranking. Now, this is going to be wildly controversial because countries are going to see that they're ranked below their neighboring countries that they've always felt superior to, right? And it's going to cause local disruption. And I've already talked with Doug Peterson of S&P. That if this data is very good, it's better than the data right now on the quality of education, what children actually get in the schools, what they actually learn, plus what we know about health outcomes is so good now that we can actually show a very strong connection to economic growth. So if you do the analysis, you take learning adjusted years of schooling, because not every country provides the same kind of schooling. You add to it things like childhood stunting and adult survival, and then you do a regression on growth looking backwards. The top quartile of countries that have improved their human capital the most have grown 1.4% per year, 1.4% of GDP per year over 25 years, faster than the bottom 25% of human capital improvers. Among the strongest correlations to economic growth we've ever seen. So the reason I'm putting the ranking out there is we could write a million wonderful papers about how important health and education are, and every head of state and minister of finance would get up and wax poetic about how important health and education are. But right now, the system is that everyone is simply waiting. Congressman Kolbe, we were too successful in a sense. There's so much money now flowing for health and education that countries are simply waiting. And they're saying, I mean, we actually heard from a middle-income country, we said, why don't you pay for your vaccines now? And that country said to us, well, why should we? Because we know if we wait long enough, the donor countries will pay for it. Right? So we're in that situation where we've not done a good enough job showing that the relationship between human capital and growth is probably as strong as it could ever be. I mean, there are a number of countries that invested in human capital before the World Bank told them that they could afford to. And they're mostly the countries that have emerged from middle-income status and become high-income countries, the East Asian countries. Right.
I'm mindful of the schedule that we have here, but most importantly, mindful of your schedule. And I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to take other questions because we have a very limited time here. But we do appreciate, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody in the room and the Bretton Woods Committee for taking time to be with us today.
Well, again, we're at the World Bank, we're extremely grateful for the support of the Bretton Woods committee members. Many of you, including Congressman Kolbe, have advocated directly for us. And we don't know where we're going on capital yet, but we will on Saturday. And so we're all just keeping our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure. Thanks.